So if there's something that I believe we can all agree on, is that open source is in the middle of a complex and multifaceted crisis. That was really brought to attention, to me at least, a couple of years ago by Nadia Egbal's work, Roads and Bridges, which talked about the work and the sustainability issues behind our digital infrastructure. More recently, folks like John Mark wrote Why Open Source Failed in Medium, and its follow-up, Save Open Source, Save the World. Mike Overby answered John Mark's article, claiming that corporate abuse was really the source of the problem. There's been a whole kerfuffle over cloud companies using software and taking the value of the work of open source companies. There's been obviously answers to that from the cloud companies themselves, such as in this article here on keeping open source open by releasing an open distribution of Elasticsearch, or a fork, depending on who you ask and what their opinion on the topic is. And more recently, we've also seen the emergence of ethical issues in the ethical open source movement. Here, an article by Caroline Etta Emke in Model View Culture. And just this summer, Bruce Perens, the inventor of the open source definition and one of the founders of the Open Source Initiative, released this video of him, which was titled What Comes After Open Source, and really acknowledges some of the failures that the open source movement has had so far. So what's interesting, if we look at all of this, all of these different aspects, all of these different facets of this crisis, is that they're really centered around three main areas. One is the increased cost of maintaining software to individuals, so maintainer burnout, essentially. The second one is a number of actors in the open source community feeling that cloud infrastructure companies are essentially capturing all of the value of the open source work, and that the actual companies or the actual individuals creating the software aren't getting a fair part of the value that they're creating. And then the last current is one that is really concerned about the ethical aspects of open source and the impact of software on end users. And so this begs the question, well, what's really going on here? And in fact, what we're seeing here, what we're witnessing, is the emergence of new constituencies that we have to cater for and take care of. So why is having new constituencies creating a crisis? Why aren't the tools that we have today to make decisions and choices in the open source community adapted to dealing with this new situation? Well, to really understand that, what we have to look at is the origin of when the four freedoms in the open source definition were created, and sort of what the ecosystem looked like back then compared to what it is today. Let's consider that today, open source and software are ubiquitous. Right? There are more than 4 billion people that have access to internet. There are tens of millions of developers, professional and non-professional. And software and open source is broadly spread across the world. All of this contrasts dearly with what open source and free software looked like when the four freedoms in the OSD were defined. We're looking back then at a way smaller ecosystem and developers and people using computers back then were often referred to, they were either professional developers working for large companies, or they were referred to as hobbyists. There was no really, computing was not really something that would happen in sort of like your day to day if you weren't either professionally involved with software, or if that was a hobby of yours, something you were invested in. And in both cases, that ecosystem was tiny, North American based, essentially, Californian to a lot of degrees, and there was a huge overlap between the people that were actually using the software and the people that were developing it, because the software was so hard to use, so complex. You really needed programming skills to be able to do anything with it, right? So the four freedoms in the OSD as sort of guiding principles for open source were designed in that context and with that environment in mind, right? Which is very, very different than the one that we have today. And so the question is, well, was that changing context, essentially, and with the increased diversity of constituencies that we have today, what do we do and how do we handle this? So having to handle a broad set of constituencies and their potentially conflicting opinions and wants and needs around the same topic is nothing new. Lots of organizations in the past have been faced with that problem. And one of the ones that I'm fairly familiar with and have worked for and with for a long time in the web standardization space is W3C. And W3C has built over a decade ago, a concept called the Priority of Constituencies. And it was actually born in the HTML Working Group IRC channel on the 27th of March 2007. And the idea was really to write down principles that had been in use by the group to make decisions in case of conflict. And so the first iteration of this ended up in the design principle, the HTML design principles. And I'm just going to read you the beginning of the Priority of Constituencies so you have an idea of what it actually describes. It says, in case of conflict, consider users over authors. So authors is W3C lingo to describe web developers. Over implementers, who are the engineers in them, the companies actually building the browsers themselves. Over specifiers, who are the people writing the specs. Over theoretical purity. So what's interesting here is that we have both a tool that's designed to organize constituencies and see which one are favored from a cost effectiveness perspective. But it's also a tool that really refocuses the whole point of building web standards and the internet on servicing end users rather than the other constituencies that are there to help create that promise. So if we turn this into sort of an equation, we have this, right? It's end users over authors, over implementers, over spec editors, over theoretical purity. And of course, from a sort of like cost effectiveness perspective, that makes a lot of sense, because if we look at the size of each constituency, we have end users are in the billions, right? There are millions of developers, something around 20 to 40 million, depending on who you ask, and it's moving quickly. Implementers are the engineers and the PMs and all the people working for browser vendors, and so they're in the thousands. And spec editors are probably in the tens to the hundreds, depending on who exactly you include in that group. And then, of course, you have theoretical purity, which is not really in the same, operating in the same space. And so another way of looking at that is sort of like, imagining the cost of 1 hour of work. If a spec editor says, well, I don't really want to spend an hour of work to like clarify this problem, that's probably going to cost hundreds of hours at the implementer level to of bugginess, of like bug fixing, of lack of clarity, of misunderstandings of reading the specs, etc. And those bugs are probably going to cost like millions of hours at the web developer level. And this is going to have an impact of billions of hours at the end user, right? Because every time you're sort of like increasing 1,000-fold, basically, sort of, between those different levels, which is why you really want to make sure that you move everything towards upstream as possible, because that's much more cost effective and is much better for end users. And that should be the goal of software in general. What's interesting is if you look at this formula again, and you focus on the end user bit and the theoretical purity bit, right? And you sort of like bring them together, this reminds me a lot of the Apache Software Foundation mantra of people over code, right? So, and and these two different organizations solving sort of like different problems, and of course the people over code of the Apache Software Foundation is really about the community around the open source project, and so not necessarily the broader constituencies yet, but it has the same notion of people over code that we see in the W3C's Priority of Constituencies, which is really end users over theoretical purity. So what would an open source priority of constituencies look like? Well, in order to find that out, what we have to do is list all of the constituencies of open source today, so beyond just the developer and the user of a piece of software, and see how we could organize them in a way similar to how W3C has organized their own constituents. So who do we have in open source? Well, we have, of course, maintainers, which can be individuals or corporations. We have contributors, which also can be both individuals and corporations. We have the cloud infrastructure. We have application developers, which are using open source to produce closed source software, or using open source to produce more open source software. And then, of course, we have end users of the software that's produced that way. And we have people that are impacted by the software, but not even using it. For example, consider someone that is walking down the street and who is being filmed, and who is being recognized by facial recognition using software that's been created by someone somewhere, right? So not even aware that they are using software right now, but still subject to it. So if we sort of organize all of these different constituencies in a similar structure, focusing strictly on how costly it is to implement a solution or a feature at every level, this is what we get, right? So we get people over end users, over app developers, over cloud infrastructure, over contributors, over maintainers, over theoretical purity. And I'm sure you will be quick to point out that maintainers and contributors are already overworked and burning out. How come they are above or below in the considerations, if you will, to cloud infrastructure? Well, from a cost effectiveness perspective, that makes sense, right? Because fixing something in the upstream project that, at the maintainer level, if you will, is way more effective than having every cloud infrastructure implement that change themselves and maintain a fork, etc. So that's the reasoning behind this. But you're right to point out that this is a problem, and we'll get to it immediately. But to answer this, we'll go back to see if W3C's priority of constituencies is actually a silver bullet, for W3C itself. To answer this, we have to consider the economic situation of the different constituencies. Let's look at this. Obviously, end users are individuals with varying financial means, but generally, compared to large implementers, are really on the low end of the sort of financial ability. Authors can be a single person publishing content on the web, all the way to multi-billion-dollar corporations like Facebook. So obviously, how well off they are in their economic situation is extremely broad. Like the fork is extremely broad, but generally we can consider them better off in a more stable economic situation than end users. Of course, implementers, although there are smaller browser vendors, among the biggest browser vendors, Apple and Google, and to some degree Microsoft, are also some of the largest companies in the world. Now, spec editors oftentimes work for implementers, but that's not always the case. And it's actually extremely valuable to get the perspective of spec editors who are not working for large corporations and who can drive what end users care about, or even what developers and authors care about, in a more was more sort of personal experience in them. And it turns out that that's when that's the case, as you can see, there's something sort of, if you focus on the implementer to spec editor space, well, we had this nice progression of an increasingly better economic situation as we moved upstream and had to do more work. We have this like weird tension, a weird drop right here, right? And this, of course, is highly problematic because it tends to push spec editors who are operating in that space, was on one hand the will to do good and sort of the pressure to fulfill this priority of constituencies and really take on the work at the spec editor level to make sure that the work doesn't need to be done multiple times downstream. But of course, that ends up being extremely costly for spec editors in just in terms of like financial situation, and sometimes even in terms of mental health, generated from sort of like the stress of having to handle the situation, and doing that was extremely little financial means to do so. So one of the solutions that has started to take place is to have sort of implementers via W3C start helping fund spec editors, or what we also called invited experts. So people that come that are not working for companies, that are sort of independent and that are participating in the standards bodies. And so, yeah, this is an article I wrote last year on the topic saying that W3C really wasn't doing enough to help its invited experts. The people writing the standards. And I'm sure that this whole tension of having people feel a lot of guilt that they have to be working on something and not being really paid for it, and feeling like they have to, rings a bell. Right? This is the parallel here. Was the feeling of maintainers is very explicit. If we go back to our open source priority of constituencies, and we do what we did for the W3C one, which is to look at the financial situation of every constituencies, well, we see the same increase of financial buying power, or whatever you want to call it, as you move from people to end users to app developers to cloud infrastructure, right? And then at the contributors and maintainers level, so I've split it up here between individuals and corporations to make it more clear, right? So individuals are not making a lot of money, obviously, and don't have a really high financial situation, and corporations are usually better off, right? We sort of see emerge the same kind of issue here that we had in W3C, right? Which is concentration of money somewhere in the middle of this priority of constituencies, or at least in a place that is not coherent with the necessity of having to do more work than constituencies that are before in the priority. So again, here, the solution that we've seen so far is to see app developers and cloud infra start funding open source, right? And this is exactly what is happening to some degree through foundations, for example, where large companies are sponsoring foundations, which are then creating sort of like small travel funds and that kind of solution, right? So obviously, this is just one option of the solution to this particular problem. But what I find interesting here is that this priority of constituencies not only sort of like organizes the work in a logical way, but also makes it super obvious to see where there are going to have points of frictions in the future and in advance, right? Imagine now that we want to add sort of like community managers of software, of open source software projects in this mix, and to put those in the priority of constituencies. So they probably belong somewhere between contributors and maintainers, I would suggest, or between cloud infra and contributors. Either way, we can see right away that these are going to be people who don't have the financial situation and the means of cloud infrastructure, and yet are going to be responsible for a lot more work, and will have a lot more responsibility and accountability than people lower down the list, right? People who are more prioritized, if you want. And as a result, we can already see that this is going to be problematic. And I'm sure if we just ask people in the room right now, if we were like physically in the same room, it would be fairly obvious that the same kind of issues around burnout that we see from maintainers probably show up with community managers that are not funded directly by a large corporation just the same. So in conclusion, what I really find valuable and interesting about a priority of constituency is that it keeps us focused on people and downstream impact. What I do as an engineer, as a maintainer, as a contributor, as an application developer, as a cloud infrastructure provider, impacts people. And the priority of constituencies reminds us all the time about this. I think that's really important. And that is really close to the Apache Software Foundation People Over Code guiding principle. The second really interesting point of a priority of constituency is it maximizes the benefits to the commons by upstreaming work. And then lastly, which is the point I was just making earlier, such a priority of constituency surfaces the discrepancies between the economic situation of individual actors or actors in this framework and their work expectations, right? So because you want to maximize benefits to the commons by moving everything upstream, you have to make sure that you also fund upstream actors so that you don't get huge discrepancies and all of the burnout issues that we were talking about and that we've seen affect people in our community.